Hello, everybody. It is Monday, and it is I, Mr. Aaron, returning for some more reading awesomeness. Now, we are going to be returning to the world of Stanley this week. Only this is our last Stanley story was Stanley after he had rounded back out. But this is Stanley while he is still Flat Stanley. So we are going to be reading Flat Stanley's Worldwide Adventures, The Great Egyptian Grave Robbery. Sounds super exciting. I'm excited. I hope you guys are too. Let's dive right in, shall we? Chapter 1. A Letter for Stanley. George Lambchop was sitting at the kitchen table going through the mail as his wife cooked breakfast. "Look at these beauties, Harriet," he called, holding up a letter with many exotic stamps in the corner. "From Egypt." Ever since their eldest son, Stanley, had been flattened by a bulletin board and could now travel by mail, the Lambchop family had become keenly interested in stamps. "In a minute, dear," Mrs. Lambchop said. "I'm just at the difficult part of flipping this French toast. A letter from Egypt, you say? Why don't you open it and read it to me?" Mr. Lambchop began to do just that, but then he caught himself. "That was a close one," he cried. "It's a federal offense to open mail that's addressed to someone else. This letter is for Stanley." Just then both Lambchop boys appeared in the doorway, drawn by the delicious aroma of French toast and bacon. "Stanley, son, letter for you here. Looks important." "What about me?" Stanley's younger brother Arthur asked. "Any mail for me today?" "Not today, sorry," Mr. Lambchop replied. "But Stanley, why don't you open yours and read it to us over breakfast?" "After breakfast," Mrs. Lambchop said firmly. "And hand-washing. You know how maple syrup gets all over everything." The boys finished their breakfast and washed up. Then Stanley read his letter. "If you are the world-famous flattened boy of America," he read out loud, "and if you are less than 3 inches thick, you must come to Egypt at once. We are beginning an archaeological project and are in urgent need of someone of your dimensions." "I don't know about world famous," Arthur grumbled a bit enviously. It must be said. "Maybe they've got the wrong person." "But I am only half an inch thick," Stanley sighed. "That's me, all right." Mrs. Lambchop corrected her son. "That is I." "It's signed Sir Abu Shinti Hawara IV, Stanley said. "And look, he's taken care of my travel arrangements." Stanley held up a very large envelope covered in stamps. George Lambchop took the letter and read it over. "No mention of Stanley's family going with him," he said, frowning. "I don't know." "Well, an archaeological project, it's not as if it's something dangerous. And travel is broadening, George," Mrs. Lambchop mused. "Oh, Stanley, darling, I didn't mean it that way. What I meant was, it rounds out one's education to—" Oh, that didn't come out quite right either. "Well, your mother and I have always encouraged you boys to lend a helping hand when needed," Mr. Lambchop said. "I suppose that goes even if it's needed halfway around the world." "We'd better take you to the post office at once, Stanley," Mrs. Lambchop said. "I'll pack leftover French toast and bacon for you to eat on the way. No maple syrup, of course. It wouldn't do to arrive all sticky." "Something to drink?" Stanley asked. "I think not, dear," his mother told him. "Egypt is quite a distance, and I'm afraid you won't be near a bathroom for some time. Which reminds me—" She went off to pack a toothbrush and a washcloth for her son's trip. Stanley noticed that Arthur seemed glum. He knew Arthur sometimes found it difficult being the only round brother in the family. "Would you like me to bring something from Egypt back for you?" he asked. "Humph," Arthur replied. "If you're going to Egypt, you should bring me back a mummy." I don't believe they offer those as souvenirs. And besides, it wouldn't fit in the envelope with Stanley, chuckled the boy's father. Mr. Lambchop was known for his sharp sense of humor. How about a nice postcard? Mr. Lambchop was also known for being a practical thinker. Arthur folded his hands across his chest. Huh, a mummy or nothing? Stanley was very sorry to see his brother looking so grumpy as he slid himself into the envelope. Chapter 2. Amici. The journey was very long, much, much longer than his trip to California. At last he arrived, and just in time. "Let me out, please!" he cried. "I'm broiling in here." "Sorry," came an official-sounding voice. "An envelope can only be opened by the person to whom it is addressed. Whoever you are, you will have to wait until you are delivered tomorrow." Just then Stanley heard another voice, the voice of a young girl. "That package is flat," the voice said. Then it came closer. "You in there," it demanded. "Do you happen to be Stanley Lambchop of America?" "I am," Stanley cried in astonishment. "But how do you know—" "Open this package," the girl said to the postmaster. "I will take full responsibility. I will hand-deliver the contents to its destination. It's an antiquities bazaar right across from my father's office." As soon as the flap was opened, Stanley burst from the envelope to greet his liberator. "Hello, my name is Amici," the girl said, smiling. "I am very pleased to meet you, Stanley." "But how do you know who I am?" Amici smiled even more broadly. "My father is the curator of the National Historical Museum. He is also a member of the Museum Curators Worldwide Pen Pal Club. His pen pal is—" "Mr. O.J. Dart!" Stanley guessed, delighted. Mr. O.J. Dart was Stanley's upstairs neighbor. He was also the curator of the famous museum, and not long ago Stanley had helped him out with a certain predicament involving sneak thieves. "Right," Amici agreed. "When Mr. Dart wrote to him about what you did, my father couldn't stop talking about you. He said he wished Egypt had a flat kid who would help out like that in a museum. A kid like that could come in quite handy, he said. He even hung a bulletin board over my bed, hoping that something might happen, but my mother made him take it down again." "That's good," Stanley said. "Being flat is more trouble than some people imagine it to be." Chapter 3. Walk Like an Egyptian. Stanley found being out in the sunshine very pleasant after being cooped up in a dark envelope for so long. "Is it always this warm and sunny in Egypt?" he asked. "It's not always this warm," Amici answered, "but yes, it's usually sunny. It doesn't rain here often, but when it does, we can get downpours." She pointed to a beautiful river in the distance, fringed with palm trees. "Sometimes the Nile floods, and in the spring we can get sandstorms." Amici was a very good guide. She pointed out mosques and gardens and historical sites. They stopped at a stall where she treated Stanley to some Egyptian food, falafel, kebabs, and dates. They ate as they walked, and Stanley found it all very tasty indeed. "Well, here we are," Amici nodded across the street to a narrow alleyway crowded with booths. "That's the Antiquities Bazaar you were addressed to." She turned and pointed to a sign above them. "National Historical Museum. And here's where my father works. Would you like to come in? He'd be so thrilled to meet you." Stanley wanted to get to work on the archaeological adventure right away, but he knew that being polite and friendly always paid off. "Lead the way," he said. Amici laughed as they stepped inside. "See those hieroglyphs? They'll lead the way." Stanley admired the black images on the wall. Hieroglyphs were the system of writing in pictures used by the ancient Egyptians. The people and animals were always drawn sideways, which told which direction to read them. "My father had these painted to point the way to his office," Amici explained. As they walked through the rooms in the museum, Stanley saw many amazing things. Golden masks and statues, silver and bronze coins, turquoise and ivory jewelry, beautifully decorated urns and pots. "Your country is full of treasures," he marveled. "Yes," Amici agreed, "but we are losing them. Criminals are looting the pyramids and then exporting the artifacts. My father says they're even worse than sneak thieves. Well, here we are." They entered the office marked Curator. Inside, a tall, smiling man came over and hugged Amici. "Father, this is Stanley Lambchop," she said. "Stanley Lambchop," Amici's father repeated, scratching his head. Now, where have I heard that name before?" "Your pen pal's letter," Amici reminded him. He slapped his head. "Holy sarcophagus! The sneak thieves' hero?" He stood back and eyed Stanley up and down. "Why, yes, just as old Darty described you. Flat as a pancake. What a thing! That bulletin board. It was hanging over your bed. Is that the story? About how far off the floor?" "Father," Amici said, "remember Mother strictly forbade you trying to flatten me." "Oh, right, of course. Now what brings you to our country, Stanley?" Stanley explained about the request to help with an important archaeological expedition. "Very interesting," said Amici's father. "Now that bulletin board, exactly how heavy was it? Do you recall?" "Father!" "Oh, of course, I know. It's just that... So simple, really. What a help to the famous museum. Really, Stanley, when old Darty explained what you did, how brave you were." Stanley blushed. He really hadn't done much more than hang inside of a picture frame and yell for the police when the sneak thieves snuck in. He didn't tell Amici and her father this, but what had taken the most courage, actually, was wearing a dress in the painting. "May I give you a personal... Oh, wrong voice. May I give you a personal tour of our museum?" asked Amici's father. "It would be an honor." "I'm sure I would enjoy that," Stanley said, "but the letter said the situation was urgent. I think it's time I got to work." He said goodbye to Amici and her father and left the museum. Chapter 4. The Mission. The bazaar was colorful, with overflowing displays and noisy with cheerful shouts of buyers and sellers. Booths were piled with antiquities, woven rugs and embroidered cloths, ancient pottery and plates, brass lamps, gold jewelry, silver brushes and combs, decorated tablets and scrolls. Everywhere Stanley smelled incense and perfume and spices. Donkeys brayed and carts jostled the crowds. Now and then Stanley had to turn sideways to get through without bumping into anything. "Sometimes," he reminded himself, "sometimes being flat makes me feel lucky. But mostly," he reminded himself back, "mostly being flat just makes me feel flat." He couldn't help wondering which way he would feel at the end of this adventure. If he ever had an adventure, how would he know he was at the right place? How would he find Sir Abu-Shinti Hawara IV? "Psst! Flatley! You Flatley, pork chop!" Before Stanley could correct whomever was there, an arm shot out and dragged him along behind a hanging rug. "Come with me," said a man in a dark uniform. "Sir's been waiting for you." The man pulled Stanley through the back alleys of the bazaar until they came to a fenced-off tent surrounded by more uniformed men. Inside, even more guards nodded at Stanley and the man and stepped inside. Inside, the tent was dark, with clouds of smoke rising from oil lamps and pots of incense. After a moment, Stanley made out a bearded man in a red robe, seated on a gold-embroidered cushion. Sir Abu-Shinti Hawara IV clapped his hands and motioned for Stanley to approach, and then he nodded to a guard. "Turn him sideways," he ordered, pointing, very rudely, Stanley thought, to Stanley. Measure him." Stanley knew it was important to be polite, even when faced with rudeness. "I'm Stanley Lambchop from America," he introduced himself. "I'm very pleased to meet you, and I hope—" "You're not likely to pop out round in the middle of things, are you?" Sir Hawara interrupted. "This flatness isn't just a party trick, right?" Stanley sighed. "Not so far." The guard had finished the measuring. "1/2 inch thick," he reported. "Good then," Sir Hawara said. "Let's get started. I've been waiting a long time for this." Pardon me. He clapped his hands again, and 6 guards sprang to his side. Several of them spread maps and photographs on the ground, while another lit his pipe. "You smoke, Lambchop?" Sir Hawara asked. Stanley shook his head no, wondering what his parents might say about this. Too flat, I suppose," Sir Hawara mused. He shook his head and then tapped his pipe on the map in front of him. "This here is the Great Pyramid of Khufufu, sealed for more than 4,000 years. It is believed that at its center, inside the pharaoh's tomb, are the priceless giant scrolls of papyrus." Stanley waved away some smoke. "And you're going to go in and find them?" "Wrong," answered Sir Hawara. "You're going to go in and find them. That's why I've brought you here." "But I don't know anything about—" Stanley began. Sir Hawara ignored him. "According to ancient lore, King Khufufu locked his tomb from inside to protect it from grave robbers." At the word grave robbers, Stanley shivered and broke into goose discs. Since his encounter with the bulletin board, Stanley's goosebumps now came up as flat as the rest of him, more like tiny discs than bumps. "Nothing to be alarmed about," Dr. Dan had assured his parents when they'd noticed this. "Perfectly normal in these cases. I've been expecting it." "Also," Sir Hawara continued, "he had dozens of trick passageways built, leading nowhere. However, he did leave one way out, a passageway 3 inches wide, just wide enough for his soul to escape." He pointed his pipe at Stanley. "That's where you come in. I have found the entrance to that passageway. You're going to enter the tomb, find out if the scrolls are really there, and then unlock the tomb from inside. Got it?" Stanley nodded. "Good." Sir Hawara rose from his cushion and clapped his hands one more time. "Saddle up a camel for our flat friend," he ordered a guard. Then he turned to Stanley. "1 hump or 2?" Stanley stared at him. "That's a joke, Lambchop," Hawara said. "We only have 1-humped camels here in Egypt." And that brings us to the end of a chapter, so I think that is where we are going to end for today. But be sure to tune in again tomorrow at 2 p.m. as we continue the story of Flat Stanley and the Great Egyptian Grave Robbery. Thanks so much for joining me, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Of course, be sure to check out our other live programs, Toddler Time with Miss Becky, Stories with Sunny, and Creating with Constance. And don't forget that you can still access digital content through the library's website, sweetwaterlibraries.com, in the form of Law and Overdrive and RB Digital and Cloud Library. You can get ebooks and audiobooks and movies and all kinds of cool stuff through there. So be sure to check it out, and we will see you tomorrow.